So I have a question for you. Which of the Toamata from Bionicle 2001 has the best chance of knocking a mask off of their opponent? We're going to try to answer that question today, and we're going to go even further. I'm talking about the strategies involved. Literally, I'm getting into the nitty-gritty details, into the weeds of all of the weapons that were introduced in 2001. Not just the Toamata, but also the Turaga, and what you need to pay attention to when it comes time for you to hop up on that stage on the World Tournament, the World Tour of Bionicle Battles. We all know we want it, right? Without further ado, my name is Skybird, and if you like content like this, I'm just some random guy over here on the internet talking passionately about the Bionicles that we all know and love. I would really appreciate if you'd leave a like and subscribe. It really helps out channels like this, and we are continuing to grow, getting closer to 3,000. But let's go ahead and focus on the 12 weapons in question. First things first, there are a handful of things to know, like, for example, these two weapons are the same length. I'm going to call these the long weapons, and that doesn't make a whole lot of difference because that length will essentially cancel out, but there are differences here. Notably, even though they are the same length, and even more so, the same broadness, the same width as each other, they do have differences. First off, the center of mass on each of these weapons is different. The weight is roughly identical. I did weigh these, though the scale that I have is not the most accurate thing in the world. It has its own personality, so that is going to be a separate issue, but I did try to sort of mitigate that by doing a few different types of tests. And from my testing, the difference between these two weapons was marginal. They each weighed 2 grams. In fact, all of the weapons that I weighed 2 grams with 2 exceptions. We'll get to those. So instead, what you need to pay attention to with these two weapons is most notably the shape of these weapons and sort of where they attach to the characters. I'll talk about why in a moment. First things first, with this weapon, because it has this sort of wavy edge on it, there are some scenarios where that edge can help you to catch on to a mask, to hit it at a maybe slightly more advantageous angle. However, an indirect response to that, the straighter edge on this, the uninterrupted edge, may mean that you get a more consistent hit with this weapon, which means, in theory, this weapon should be slightly more accurate, while this weapon should be slightly better at gripping masks. But then you also have to, again, look at that sort of center of mass, right? At where on this weapon is it best to hit a character, right? Is it best to hit a mask to give you the opportune ability to knock that mask off, right? Because this weapon starts to taper off quite heavily towards the tip, right? And so it's going to have a much lower center of mass, I would imagine. Also, with this weapon having so many more of these technic holes, the center of mass will likely be a bit higher on this as well. So in terms of the differences here, you're not really going to find them in the sake of the weapons. Rather, where that advantage is going to come from is the character themselves. So when we actually take a look at the Toamata, and yes, you can ignore that he's wearing the kicker from Pohatu, we'll talk about why here in a moment, all of the Toamata, with the exception of Pohatu, use this arm right here, which means two things. It does not have a posable wrist, which is important. That means all of the force that is applied to this arm is going to be translated directly into this weapon, again, with some very subtle differences due to material, whatever. None of that matters for this video, but there is a difference between Tahu and Kopaka, and it is where that pivot point is. It is the same point on the body, but Tahu's shoulder is mounted in this direction, whereas Kopaka's shoulder is actually mounted via this axle hole on top, meaning that this arm actually goes down slightly. And with it going down, the point at which this rotates on the body and the point where the center of mass is on the weapon, and technically the arm as well, but let's just ignore that since they're the same arm, where it is on the weapon, that distance is going to be different, and thus Kopaka should, in theory, be slightly stronger than Tahu. So Kopaka, in theory, should have the advantage. It's marginal at best. So if I think you're looking for the most fair fight, Kopaka and Tahu are likely going to be the ones that give it to you. But now let's talk about unfair fights. As I mentioned, there are two weapons that weigh slightly more, 3 grams instead of 2. And it is this kicker right here from Pohatu and this axe. And these are both interesting weapons because the axe is the only weapon from the Toamata that is kind of like a staff. What do I mean by that? Well, if we take a look at the staves from the Turaga, what you'll note is that the center of mass is going to in essence, always be towards the top of the weapon because there's not a lot of mass in this axle here. That's kind of true here as well. The axle is subtly different because there is no axle to grab onto and actually hold all the way up this, right? But there's still not a lot of mass in this area. And because of that, the focus of that energy is all going to be in the head here. On top of that, this weapon has a second advantage in that it actually has a slight hook to it, meaning that when this mask is swung downward, as is the intention of these functions, right? A downward swing applies the force. It actually has a good chance of hitting behind the mask and then continuing that downward arc, pulling that mask off. Third, because of that mass, this weapon on its own would by far be the most effective. So in order to account for that, the hitting edge on this is much smaller. You essentially have much less accuracy with this weapon because if you don't hit this edge here and say, for example, you hit this area here, you're not going to deal a lot of impact damage. It will still deal some because that mass is still going to translate into that impact, but it's going to be diminished way more than a weapon like a sword, for example. So this is the area of impact that you want. You really want to hit on this edge here, or better yet, hit right behind here. If you hit the top and behind the mask, that does a really good job of connecting with the mask and pulling it off. However, if you're not the most accurate player, then Kopaka's sword is maybe slightly better. It weighs less, it's going to take more swings to get a mask off, but you're going to make contact more often, if that makes sense. Also worth noting, Liwa, like Kopaka, also has his arm oriented via this connection here, meaning he also has the advantage of a slightly longer arm as well. Both of those mean that Liwa, in theory, should deliver the most powerful attack. Does that make him the best? It depends on your strategy. The reason I mentioned all of this in the previous videos is because I think all of the Toamata have their strengths and have their weaknesses, meaning that you're not going to be at a huge disadvantage no matter which one you pick. Slight disadvantages, sure, and each one plays to specific strengths. We'll talk about Bohatu here in a minute, but let's go ahead and focus on the two shortest weapons from the Mata range. These two right here. These weapons are interesting because they're both hook-based weapons, meaning that they grab behind the mask and pull it down, or at least they're more likely to do so. However, to make up for that, these weapons are both significantly shorter. The range on these is lower, and in fact, this has the least range of any of the Toamata weapons at all. These do both weigh 2 grams at the very least, so they do have the weight behind them, the mass behind them, and on top of that, this weapon, although it is a shorter range, is broader. It is wider, right? And so that means if you were to swing this weapon down, you have much more forgiveness on where you hit on the head because you're going to contact that mask more frequently. No, where these characters make up for their lack of range is that they both swing 2 weapons, not just one. They're the only characters that swing both arms, meaning you get twice as many hits in for the same amount of rotations, right? There are some subtle caveats to that in terms of, well, one arm swinging one direction, one swinging the other, so the momentum kind of cancels out, but then there's some physics involved with that as well that sort of can't. The point being, though, is that you're going to have less range with these types of weapons, but they can still deliver a powerful hit. And of course, it always depends on which direction you decide to turn the axle, right? Because you could just as easily go front to back and be a player like that just slashes forward to back, or you could be somebody who revolves the axle over and over again, right? So there are strategies here. Yeah, we're getting into the weeds. I told you, man. However, one weapon is a bit more interesting than all of the others for a handful of reasons. As I've described, all of the weapons I've talked about so far all use this arm to connect to the body, meaning there is no wrist joint. However, the one weapon that is different is the kicker from Bohatu. This weapon has a lot of its own caveats. First off, where it is located on the body. Assuming that all of these characters have to, say, follow the rule of being on the ground, for example, when they use their attack, obviously your range is greatly reduced with this weapon, right? On top of that, this arm is very slightly shorter than this arm, but it's also very slightly heavier, so there is some mechanical advantage in this arm, but then there's some loss in it as well. Point being, it probably closely cancels out, but this weapon does weigh more. It weighs 3 grams. On top of that, unlike all of the other weapons, This one includes a foot as well, which also has its own weight. I didn't bother to weigh it because there's nothing to weigh it against, so this is just added weight, right? On top of all of that, this does have some advantages. First off, it is lacking in range, but where it is going to perform its best is when you turn the leg down, because you want the center of mass, which is roughly in this area here, to be as far away from the pivot point as possible, in this case, the hip. Obviously on Pohatu, so the body's upside down, but you get the point I'm making, right? On top of that, though, because this attack is going to deal more often than not a downward swing, because let's be honest, kids are going to be playing with these in the air, not on the ground. This does not have much surface on the bottom that is hook shaped, right? There are these points here that can hook onto a mask and pull it off, but because this is mostly flat down here, there's not a lot of scenarios where you're going to hit the mask from the top and rip it off. Rather, this does a pretty good job of hitting the mask from the bottom, from an upward kick, right? So it does have a different strategy involved. So I don't know that I could necessarily equate Pohatu with any of the other characters. But if I had to choose characters in any specific order, I want to say Liwa is who I would choose first, then Onua, which is interesting. It also has to deal with the placement of where his head is on the bottom, on the body, rather. That's different. That's a separate thing all on its own. But Onua, because of how broad those weapons are and how fast they swing. Then I would probably choose Pohatu, and I think Pohatu and Gali are kind of similar. Pohatu's weapon weighs a lot more, but Gali obviously has double the swings, right? Pohatu's head placement also has an effect, again, not getting into that here. Lastly, I would say Kopaka and Tahu are sort of your bottom of the barrel, but again, they're all within shooting range of each other. They're all so close together that it's not going to be a huge difference. Ironically, too, Tahu being the leader of this, he would actually kind of technically be the worst because this weapon is ever so slightly worse than Kopaka's sword and because of the arm placement. But again, it's so marginal, it doesn't really matter. So what about the Turaga weapons? I'm going to try and make this quick. But Turaga weapons come in basically two lengths. This length right here, which is as long as any of the Toa long weapons, right? And then this length right here, the trident, significantly shorter. But in order to make up for that, because these weapons don't exist in a vacuum, if you take them into context of the character that uses them, Nokama has longer arms, meaning that this weapon's range is actually roughly close to this one, if we assume the characters are holding it from the bottom of the axle. The reason that's important is because that's actually where you're going to have the most mechanical advantage, because the center of mass is the furthest point away from the pivot that it can be. The pivot point doesn't care about all of this extra distance in here. It only cares about the point at which it pivots, at which it rotates, and the center of mass, right? So if you just drew a straight line between those 2 points, the character that has the longest line and pairs that with the heaviest weapon, in theory, should have the greatest chance of knocking weapons off. This does not always hold true because, again, some of these weapons do have hook shapes. For example, this weapon right here has 2 hooks on it, right? Even this hammer has a slight hook underneath this, and of course, this staff has plenty of hooks on it. But interestingly enough, these weapons all weighed the least from what I measured, with this one also weighing roughly the least as well. Still, all 2 grams, but within that 2 to 1 gram range, you know, this was probably the lightest weight weapon overall, potentially this one, but that's, again, getting into the weeds here too much. So with that said, you kind of look at the characters, who wields them, what the length of their arm is. You could technically say that the height plays some sort of into this game. I don't think it's quite as focused. And as somebody mentioned in a previous video, I'm probably overthinking this. And that is probably true. I guarantee you that LEGO did not put as much thought into this as I did. But the fact that it's here in the first place is still fun to look at. It's sometimes fun to hyperfixate, to speculate, and to just think for a couple of moments that, you know, maybe this wasn't intentional, but it's still kind of neat that it sort of aligns with certain aspects of lore. In this case, obviously, this doesn't align with lore. No character is like theoretically stronger than the other, although it is fun that we see Liwa and Onua battle in lore, and they both kind of have the best weapons depending on your strategy and how you play. But going back to the video I made talking about how Bionicle tells a story without saying a word, I specifically focus on masks and materials there, and that, at the very least, I think is somewhat intentional. As intentional as I implied, I can't know. I wasn't in the design team back in 2001, but it is pretty cool to see either way. So if you guys did enjoy this type of content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, because it does help the channel out more than you know, helps it out more than I know, honestly, and it continues getting us even closer to that 3,000 subscriber goal, the next big milestone. On top of that, you can help the channel go even further by leaving a comment below. Tell me your thoughts on these weapons, or if not any of these weapons, which weapon do you think has the best chance of winning, at least of like the original run, the G1, or even if you want to just focus on weapons from Matanui, who knows, right? I'll leave that up to you. And of course, which weapon is your favorite? And of course, we can take the conversation further over on Discord, or you can check out the Instagram or Patreon if you want to help support the channel and videos like this. I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.